In April 1941, Belgrade endures a two-day assault by the Luftwaffe, an attack so fierce it stuns all of Europe. We will clearly outline the situation. We are tracing Adolf Hitler's campaign to solidify his southern borders before he turns his attention to the Soviet Union. You will witness how Italy's misstep in Greece drew Britain into the Balkans, how Hitler retaliated with Operation Marita through Bulgaria, and how a coup in Yugoslavia prompted a blitzkrieg that circled Allied defenses, resulting in a challenging evacuation from mainland Greece. We will follow the Royal Navy's victory at Cape Matapan, examine why it could not prevent the ensuing events, and explore how Crete became the site of the war's first significant airborne invasion and a costly defeat for the Allies. Simultaneously, we will see Erwin Rommel arrive in North Africa under Operation Sunflower, advance toward Egypt, and besiege Tobruk while British resources are drawn away to Greece. Lastly, we will discuss what all of this meant for the timing of Operation Barbarossa, Malta, and the oil fields of Ploesti, as well as the shifting power dynamics in the Mediterranean. Once Hitler recognized that his efforts to conquer Britain had failed, he focused on the primary goal of his life. Yet before launching an invasion of the Soviet Union, he was determined to secure both flanks. He began discussions with Finland, but the Balkans held greater significance. The oil fields of Ploesti would supply the fuel for his tank divisions, and the Romanian army, led by Marshal Ion Antonescu, would provide troops. Aware that the Soviet Union also considered southeastern Europe within its sphere of influence, Hitler understood the necessity of proceeding cautiously to avoid provoking Joseph Stalin prematurely. Mussolini's disastrous campaign in Greece inadvertently produced the very outcome that Hitler dreaded: a British military presence in southeastern Europe. In April 1939, Britain had extended a guarantee of support to Greece, which prompted General Metaxas to seek assistance. The British sent fighter planes with the first squadrons of the Royal Air Force arriving in Greece during the second week of November 1940. British forces landed on Crete to enable Greek troops to serve on the Albanian front. Fearing that the British might use Greek airfields to strike at the oil fields in Ploesti, Hitler requested that the Bulgarian government establish early warning observation posts along their border. However, Metaxas insisted that the British refrain from attacking the Ploesti oil wells, as that would provoke Nazi Germany. His nation could manage the Italians, but not the Wehrmacht. Hitler had started to contemplate invading Greece, partly to rectify the Italian embarrassment, which negatively impacted the Axis overall, but mainly to safeguard Romania. On November 12th, he instructed the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces to devise a plan for an invasion via Bulgaria to secure the northern Aegean coastline, codenamed Operation Marita. The Air Force and Navy soon convinced him to extend the operation to encompass all of mainland Greece. Marita was intended to follow the execution of Operation Felix, the attack on Gibraltar in the spring of 1941, along with the occupation of northwest Africa with 2 divisions. Concerned that the French colonies might switch allegiance from Vichy, Hitler ordered preparations for Operation Attila, which involved seizing French territories and their fleet. These measures would be implemented with considerable severity if there was any resistance. With Gibraltar being crucial to the British position in the Mediterranean, Hitler decided to send Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the head of the Military Intelligence Service, to meet with Francisco Franco. He was tasked with securing permission for German troop movements along Spain's Mediterranean coast in February. However, Hitler's belief that Franco would ultimately side with the Axis turned out to be overly optimistic. Franco made it clear that he would consider entering the war only when Britain was on the verge of collapse. Despite this setback in the Western Mediterranean, Hitler refused to abandon the initiative and shifted his focus to the southern front of Operation Barbarossa. By December 5, 1940, he declared he would send only 2 Luftwaffe groups to Sicily and southern Italy to target British naval forces in the eastern Mediterranean. At that moment, he opposed deploying ground troops to assist the Italians in Libya. Yet, in the second week of January 1941, the significant success of Lieutenant Colonel O'Connor's advance prompted him to reconsider. While Libya was not of great concern to him, the potential overthrow of Mussolini posed a substantial threat to the Axis and would bolster his opponents. The Luftwaffe's presence in Sicily was expanded to include the entire 10th Air Corps, and the 5th Light Division was instructed to prepare for operations in North Africa. By February 3rd, it became evident, following O'Connor's striking victory, that Tripolitania was also in jeopardy. Consequently, Hitler ordered the deployment of a corps under the command of Lieutenant General Erwin Rommel, whom he was familiar with from the campaigns in Poland and France. The military group would be named the Deutsches Afrika Korps, and the initiative would be referred to as Operation Sunflower. Mussolini had no option but to allow Rommel to take direct charge of the Italian forces. After discussions in Rome on the 10th of February, Rommel flew to Tripoli 2 days later. He quickly dismissed Italian defense plans for the city. The front line would be established much further forward at Sirte until his troops had disembarked, but he soon realized this would take some time. The 5th Light Division would not be prepared for action until early April. Meanwhile, the 10th Flieger Corps in Sicily bombarded the island of Malta, focusing on airfields and the naval base in Valletta, while also targeting British supply convoys traversing the Mediterranean. The Kriegsmarine attempted to encourage the Italian Navy to engage the British Mediterranean fleet, but their persuasion yielded little result until the end of March. Preparations for Operation Merida, the invasion of Greece, proceeded through the initial months of 1941. Units of the 12th Army under General Feldmarschall Wilhelm List advanced through Hungary into Romania. Both nations had anti-communist governments and had allied with the Axis through vigorous diplomacy. Bulgaria also needed to be secured so that German forces could pass through its territory. Stalin observed these events with great suspicion. He was not convinced by the Germans' claims that their presence was solely aimed at the British, but he had limited options. The British, acutely aware of the German military buildup along the lower Danube, decided to take action. Churchill, driven by the need for British credibility and the desire to impress the Americans, instructed Wavell to set aside plans for an advance into Tripolitania and instead send 3 divisions to Greece. With Metaxas having recently passed away from throat cancer, the new Prime Minister, Alexandros Korizis, now facing the reality of the German threat, was ready to accept any assistance, no matter how small. Neither the somber Wavell nor Admiral Cunningham believed this expeditionary force would be capable of stopping the Germans. But since Churchill felt that British honor was at stake, and Eden was fully convinced it was the right course of action, they had to agree on the 8th of March. In reality, more than half of the 58,000-strong force dispatched to fulfill the British commitment to Greece consisted of Australian and New Zealand troops. They were the formations most readily available, but this would lead to significant resentment from Australia and New Zealand later. General Sir Maitland Wilson, nicknamed Jumbo due to his considerable size, commanded the expeditionary force. Wilson understood the challenges that lay ahead. After an overly optimistic briefing by the British minister in Athens, Sir Michael Palaret, he remarked, "Well, I don't know about that. I've already ordered my maps of the Peloponnese." This southernmost region of the Greek mainland was where his troops would need to be evacuated if they faced defeat. Senior officers viewed the Greek operation as potentially another Norway, while younger Australian and New Zealand officers eagerly spread maps of the Balkans, examining invasion routes through Yugoslavia toward Vienna. Wilson's W Force prepared to confront a German invasion from Bulgaria, positioning itself along the Ali-Akman line, which ran along the river of the same name and diagonally from the Yugoslav border to the Aegean coast near Mount Olympus. Major General Bernard Freyberg's 2nd New Zealand Division occupied the right flank, while the 6th Australian Division held the left, with the British 1st Armoured Brigade acting as a forward screen. The Allied troops regarded their days of waiting as idyllic. Despite the chilly nights, the weather was splendid, wildflowers blanketed the mountains, and Greek villagers were exceptionally kind and welcoming. As British and Dominion forces in Greece anticipated the German attack, the German Navy pressured the Italian Navy to launch an offensive against the British fleet, diverting attention from the transports carrying Rommel's troops to North Africa. The Italians enjoyed support from the ex-Flieger Corps in southern Italy and were motivated to retaliate for the Royal Navy's bombardment of Genoa. On the 26th of March, the Italian Navy set sail with the battleship Vittorio Veneto, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 13 destroyers. Cunningham, alerted to this threat through an ultra-intercept of Luftwaffe communications, strategically deployed his warships. His own Force A, consisting of the battleships HMS Warspite, Valiant, and Barham, the aircraft carrier HMS Formidable, and 9 destroyers alongside Force B, which included 4 light cruisers and 4 destroyers. On the 28th of March, an Italian seaplane from the Vittorio Veneto spotted the cruisers of Force B. Admiral Angelo Iachino's squadron embarked on a chase, unaware of Cunningham's position east of Crete and south of Cape Matapan. Torpedo planes from HMS Formidable struck the Vittorio Veneto, but it managed to evade capture. A subsequent wave targeted the heavy cruiser Pola, bringing it to a standstill. Other Italian vessels were dispatched for assistance, which gave the British an opportunity. Effective gunnery resulted in the sinking of 3 heavy cruisers, including the Pola, along with 2 destroyers. Though Cunningham felt deep frustration over the Vittorio Veneto's escape, the Battle of Cape Matapan marked a significant psychological victory for the Royal Navy. The German offensive in Greece was slated to commence in early April, but an unanticipated crisis erupted in Yugoslavia. Adolf Hitler had been working to win over the nation, particularly its regent, Prince Paul, as part of his diplomatic efforts to secure the Balkans ahead of Operation Barbarossa. However, resentment was rising among the Yugoslavs, primarily due to aggressive German tactics aimed at acquiring their resources. Hitler pressed the Belgrade government to join the Tripartite Pact, and on the 4th of March, he and Joachim von Ribbentrop exerted strong pressure on Prince Paul. The Yugoslav government hesitated, acutely aware of mounting domestic opposition, but Berlin's demands became overwhelming. Ultimately, on the 25th of March in Vienna, Prince Paul and government representatives signed the pact. 2 days later, Serbian officers took control in Belgrade. Prince Paul was ousted from his position, and the young King Peter II was installed on the throne. Anti-German protests erupted in Belgrade, including an attack on the car of the German minister. Hitler, as recounted by his interpreter, was left gasping for revenge, convinced that the British were involved in the coup. Ribbentrop was swiftly summoned from a meeting with the Japanese foreign minister, to whom he had just proposed that Japanese forces should capture Singapore. Following this, Hitler ordered the High Command to prepare for an invasion, with no ultimatum or declaration of war necessary. The Luftwaffe was instructed to strike Belgrade as soon as possible, with the operation named Strafgericht, meaning retribution. Hitler viewed the coup in Belgrade on March 27th as definitive evidence of a conspiracy of the Jewish Anglo-Saxon warmongers and the Jewish leaders in the Moscow Bolshevik headquarters. He even persuaded himself that it was a despicable betrayal of the German-Soviet Friendship Pact, which he had already intended to violate. Even though the Yugoslav government had declared Belgrade an open city, the German forces commenced their actions on Palm Sunday, April 6th. Over 2 days, the 4th Air Fleet decimated much of the city. Estimating civilian casualties is challenging, with figures ranging from 1,500 to 30,000, likely settling around the midpoint. The Yugoslav government hastily forged an agreement with the Soviet Union, but Joseph Stalin remained inactive, fearing repercussions from Adolf Hitler. As the bombing of Belgrade unfolded that Sunday morning with 500 aircraft, the German minister in Athens notified the Greek prime minister that Wehrmacht forces would invade Greece due to the presence of British troops there. Chrysis replied that Greece would stand its ground. Just before dawn on April 6th, List's 12th Army initiated simultaneous attacks moving south into Greece and west into Yugoslavia. A soldier in the 11th Panzer Division recorded in his diary, "At 5:30 a.m., the assault on Yugoslavia commenced. The tanks roared to life. Light artillery fired, heavy artillery joined in. Reconnaissance planes flew in, followed by 40 Stukas bombing the positions. The barracks ignited, a magnificent sight at dawn." Early that same morning, the famously overconfident general of the Air Force, Wolfram von Richthofen, commander of the 8th Air Corps, went to observe the assault of the 5th Mountain Division by the Rupel Pass near the Yugoslav border and witness his Stukas in action. In his journal, he noted, "At the command post at 4 a.m., as dawn broke, the artillery started. Powerful fireworks, then the bombs. One wonders if we are overestimating the Greeks." However, the 5th Mountain Division faced an unpleasant surprise when Richthofen's aircraft accidentally bombed their own troops. The Greeks proved to be far more resilient than he had anticipated. The hastily mobilized Yugoslav army, lacking both anti-aircraft and anti-tank weaponry, stood little chance against the might of the German Air Force and Panzer divisions. The Germans observed that Serbian units fought with greater determination than Croats or Macedonians, who often surrendered immediately. One column of 1,500 prisoners was mistakenly attacked by Stukas, resulting in a horrific loss of life. Richthofen's reaction was simply, "That's war." The invasion of Yugoslavia posed an unforeseen threat to the Ali Akman line. If the Germans advanced south through the Monastir Gap near Florina, which they inevitably would, then the Allied positions would be immediately outflanked. The troops positioned along the Ali Akman line needed to be withdrawn to confront this new threat. Adolf Hitler aimed to encircle the Allied expeditionary force in Greece and wipe it out. He was unaware that General Wilson possessed a secret advantage. For the first time, ultra intercepts decoded at Bletchley Park provided a field commander with warnings about movements of the German army. However, both British and Greek command faced disappointment due to the swift downfall of the Yugoslav army, which resulted in only 151 German casualties during the entire campaign. The Greek forces defending the Metaxas line near the Bulgarian border fought valiantly, but eventually a section of the German 18th Mountain Corps broke through from the southeastern edge of Yugoslavia, opening the pathway to Salonika. On the morning of April 9th, Richthofen received the surprising news that the 2nd Panzer Division had entered the suburbs. Nevertheless, the Greeks persisted in launching counterattacks near the Rupel Pass, compelling a now more cautious Richthofen to send bombers to disrupt them. On April 11th, the British 1st Armored Brigade to the south of Vevey encountered elements of the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Major Jerry de Winton, the commander of the Signal Squadron, recalled the valley scene in the evening light as resembling a painting by Lady Butler, with the sun setting on the left, the Germans assaulting from the front, and the gunners positioned on the right with their limbers. An ultra-intercept showed that this stand was effective, reporting violent resistance faced by the Schutzstaffel Adolf Hitler near Vevey. Yet such instances were rare. A withdrawal began from mountain pass to mountain pass, with the Allied units managing to stay just ahead of the Germans. Greek units, lacking motor transport, fell behind, creating a significant gap between W Force and the Greek army of Epirus on the Albanian front. Tanks and vehicles, unable to navigate the rocky terrain, had to be abandoned and destroyed as the retreating columns endured constant air assaults. The few Hurricane squadrons of the Royal Air Force, vastly outnumbered by Richthofen's Messerschmitts, could offer little assistance. During the retreat, as they moved from one makeshift airfield to another, their personnel were painfully reminded of the fall of France. Any German pilots who were shot down encountered harsh treatment from Greek villagers seeking revenge. On April 17th, the Yugoslavs surrendered. Invaded from the north by forces from Austria, from Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, their disorganized troops stood little chance. The 11th Panzer Division was quite pleased with its accomplishments. A Gefreiter wrote in his diary, "In just under 5 days, we destroyed 7 enemy divisions, seized a significant amount of war supplies, captured 30,000 prisoners, and forced Belgrade to surrender, while our own losses were minimal." A member of the 2nd SS Division Das Reich wondered, did the Serbs really believe their outdated and poorly trained army could stand against the German Wehrmacht? It's like an earthworm thinking it can swallow a boa constrictor. Despite the swift victory, Adolf Hitler remained intent on retribution against the Serbian people, whom he blamed for the First World War and its consequences. Yugoslavia was to be divided, with territories handed over to his allies in Hungary, Bulgaria, and Italy. Croatia fell under a fascist regime and became an Italian protectorate, while Germany took control of Serbia. The brutal treatment of the Serbs by the Nazis proved to be counterproductive, leading to a ferocious guerrilla war and hindering the extraction of the country's resources. The retreat in Greece, amid the scattered Yugoslavs among Allied forces and Greeks, painted surreal scenes. In the midst of one military traffic jam, a playboy from Belgrade was seen in an open Buick two-seater with his mistress. A British officer thought he was dreaming when he beheld a squadron of Serbian lancers in long cloaks gliding by like phantoms from ancient battles under the moonlight. With all communications severed between the Greek army on the left and W Force, General Wilson ordered a retreat to the Thermopylae line. This retreat was made possible through the courageous defense of the Vale of Tempe, where the 5th New Zealand Brigade successfully held back the 2nd Panzer Division and the 6th Mountain Division for 3 days. However, an ultra-intercept indicated that the Germans were advancing on the Adriatic coast toward the Gulf of Corinth. Allied soldiers in Greece felt a deep sense of shame as they destroyed bridges and railways during their retreat, yet the local people still greeted them with remarkable kindness and understanding. Orthodox priests took the time to bless their vehicles, while village women offered them flowers and bread as they left, despite the grim reality they faced under enemy occupation. They had no idea just how dire their situation would become. In a few months, a loaf of bread would skyrocket to 2 million drachmas, and within the first year of occupation, over 40,000 Greeks would perish from hunger. On April 19th, the day after the Greek Prime Minister had taken his own life, General Wavell arrived in Athens for discussions. Due to the uncertain circumstances, his staff officers were armed with service revolvers. The decision was made the following morning to evacuate all of Wilson's troops. On that day, 15 Hurricanes engaged 120 German aircraft over Athens. At the British Legation and Military Mission Headquarters, in the Hotel Grande Bretagne, officials began destroying documents, most critically the ultra-decrypts. As news of the evacuation order spread, the Allied troops were still met with encouragement. The Greeks shouted, "Come back with good fortune, return with victory." Many officers and soldiers fought back tears at the thought of leaving these individuals to face their fate. Only the urgency amidst the chaos helped to focus their minds. With a resilient rearguard of Australian and New Zealand forces to hold back the Germans, the remaining members of W Force headed to the embarkation points south of Athens in Rafina and Porto Rafti, or along the southern coast of the Peloponnese. The Germans were determined to prevent another Dunkirk miracle from occurring. While General Papagos and King George II of Greece wished to continue fighting as long as the Allied expeditionary force remained on the mainland, the commanders of the army of Epirus, facing the Italians, opted to surrender to the Germans. On April 20th, General Georgios Tsolakoglu began talks with General Feldmarschall List, stipulating that the Greek army should not have to confront the Italians. List agreed, but upon learning of this, an outraged Mussolini expressed his displeasure to Adolf Hitler, who once more did not want his ally to be humiliated. He dispatched General Lieutenant Alfred Jodl from the Wehrmacht Armed Forces High Command to oversee the surrender ceremony, with Italian officers present, instead of the furious List. The excitement of easy triumph was captured by a German artillery officer in the 11th Panzer Division, who wrote to his wife on April 22nd that if he saw the enemy, he would fire at them and always felt a wild, genuine joy in combat. He described it as a joyful war. He expressed that they were sun-kissed and confident of victory, and it felt wonderful to be part of such a division. A captain in the 73rd Infantry Division remarked that peace would eventually reach even the Balkans under a new European order, ensuring that their children would not experience war again. Shortly after the first German units entered Athens on April 26th, a massive red swastika flag was hoisted over the Acropolis. That same morning, German paratroopers landed on the southern side of the Corinth Canal in an effort to cut off the Allied retreat. In the ensuing chaos, they faced heavy losses from New Zealand soldiers operating Bofors guns and a few light tanks from the 4th Hussars. The paratroopers also failed in their primary goal to capture the bridge. The two engineer officers who had prepared for its demolition managed to return stealthily and detonate it. While the Germans celebrated their victory in Attica, the evacuation of Wilson's forces was ongoing at a frantic pace. Every possible means was employed, including Blenheim light bombers and Sunderland flying boats, which barely took off with men packed into bomb bays and gun turrets. Fishing cakes, tramp steamers, and any available vessel hurried south toward Crete. The Royal Navy dispatched 6 cruisers and 19 destroyers to rescue a battered army once again. Roads leading to the embarkation ports in the southern Peloponnese became obstructed with hastily sabotaged military vehicles. Ultimately, only 14,000 soldiers were taken prisoner of the 58,000 sent to Greece. Another 2,000 had either been killed or wounded in battle. In terms of troop numbers, the defeat could have been significantly greater, but the loss of armored vehicles, transport, and weapons was catastrophic at a time when Erwin Rommel was advancing on Egypt. Adolf Hitler felt relieved to have secured his southern flank, but he later attributed the delay in initiating Operation Barbarossa to this campaign. In more recent years, historians have debated the impact of Operation Marita on the invasion of the Soviet Union, with most agreeing that it made little difference. The delay of Operation Barbarossa from May to June is often linked to various issues, such as the slow distribution of motor transport, primarily the vehicles taken from the French Army in 1940, fuel supply challenges, and difficulties in setting up forward airfields for the Luftwaffe due to heavy spring rains. However, one significant outcome was that Operation Marita reinforced Stalin's belief that the Germans were concentrating their efforts on capturing the Suez Canal rather than invading the Soviet Union. As the overloaded ships carrying the remnants of W Force crossed the Aegean, they faced danger from Richthofen's Stukas, Junkers 88s, and Messerschmitts, resulting in the sinking of 26 vessels, including 2 hospital ships, and over 2,000 men lost their lives. A substantial portion of the casualties occurred when 2 Royal Navy destroyers, HMS Diamond and HMS Rheineck, attempted to rescue survivors from a sinking Dutch merchant ship, but both destroyers were also sunk by successive waves of German aircraft. Most of the evacuated soldiers, approximately 27,000, arrived in the large natural harbor of Suda Bay on Crete's north coast in late April. Exhausted, they made their way to shelter in olive groves, where they received hardtack biscuits and cans of bully beef. Amidst the chaos, stragglers, mechanics, base units without officers, and British civilians were unsure of their next steps. Freiburg's New Zealand division landed in an orderly fashion alongside several Australian battalions, all expecting to return to Egypt to continue fighting against Rommel. Early in February, the German High Command had considered invading Malta, supported by both the German Army and the Navy, to secure the convoy routes to Libya. However, Hitler decided to postpone the operation until later in the year, after dealing with the Soviet Union. Although the British presence in Malta would complicate the resupply of Axis forces in Libya, Hitler perceived that Allied bases on Crete posed a more significant threat, as the island could facilitate bombing raids against the oil fields at Ploesti. For similar strategic reasons, Hitler urged the Italians to hold firmly to their islands in the Dodecanese. A German occupation of Crete would also provide strategic benefits, as the island could function as a Luftwaffe base for bombing operations against the port of Alexandria and the Suez Canal. Even before Athens fell, Luftwaffe officers began exploring the possibility of launching an airborne assault on the island. General der Flieger Kurt Student, the founder of German airborne forces, was particularly enthusiastic. The Luftwaffe believed that success here would help regain its honor after failing to defeat the Royal Air Force in the Battle of Britain. Hermann Göring approved the mission and took Student to meet Adolf Hitler on April 21st. Student presented a plan to use his Sein Fliegerkorps to capture Crete and later make a drop in Egypt as Rommel's Afrika Korps advanced. Hitler was somewhat doubtful and anticipated significant losses. He dismissed the second part of Student's proposal entirely, but approved the invasion of Crete, stipulating that it must not delay the initiation of Operation Barbarossa. The operation was dubbed Merkur, meaning Mercury. Crete, as both General Archibald Wavell and Admiral Cunningham understood very well, was a challenging island to defend. The harbors and existing airfields were primarily located on the northern coast, making them highly susceptible to attacks from Axis airfields in the Dodecanese, as were the ships supplying the island. By the end of March, Ultra intercepts had detected elements of General Student's 11th Fliegerkorps in Bulgaria, including the 7th Fallschirmjäger Division. In mid-April, another intercept revealed that 250 transport aircraft had also been moved there. Clearly, a significant airborne operation was in the works, with Crete a likely target, especially if the Germans intended to use it as a launching point for the Suez Canal. A surge of Ultra intercepts in the first week of May confirmed that Crete was indeed the target. Since the British captured the island in November 1940, it had been evident to British strategists that the Germans could only seize Crete through an airborne assault. The strength of the Royal Navy in the eastern Mediterranean and the absence of Axis warships made an amphibious attack unfeasible. Brigadier O.H. Tidbury, the first commander on the island, conducted a thorough reconnaissance and marked potential German drop zones, the airfields at Heraklion, Rethymno, and Malame, along with a valley southwest of Chania. On May 6th, an Ultra intercept confirmed that Malame and Heraklion would serve for the air deployment of the remaining 11th Fliegerkorps, including headquarters and supporting army units, as well as forward bases for dive bombers and fighters. British forces had been stationed on Crete for almost 6 months, yet little progress had been made in fortifying the island, as Winston Churchill had requested. This was partly due to a lack of action, unclear planning, and the island being low on the list of priorities for General Wavell. The construction of the road from the less exposed southern coast had barely begun, and the development of airfields had stalled. Suda Bay, which Churchill envisioned as a second Scapa flow for the Navy, still lacked proper facilities. Major General Bernard Freyberg, the commander of the New Zealand Division, finally arrived on Crete aboard HMS Ajax on April 29th. True to form, he waited until nearly the last moment in Greece to ensure his men were evacuated. Freyberg, a large and imposing figure, had long been admired by Churchill for his courage during the ill-fated Gallipoli campaign, earning him the nickname Great St. Bernard. The day after he arrived, Freyberg was called to a meeting by Wavell, who flew into Crete that morning in a Blenheim bomber. They convened in a seaside villa. To Freyberg's dismay, Wavell ordered him to remain on Crete with his New Zealand troops and oversee the island's defense. Wavell briefed him on intelligence regarding a German assault, estimating it would involve 5,000 to 6,000 airborne troops, potentially accompanied by a sea attack. Freyberg felt even more disheartened upon learning about the lack of air support and worried that the Royal Navy would not be able to safeguard against a sea invasion. He seemed to misunderstand the situation from the outset, unable to conceive that Crete could be captured through an airborne assault, leading him to focus more on a seaborne threat. Wavell, however, was clear in his understanding, as his communications to London indicated that the Axis powers simply did not possess the naval strength for an invasion by sea. This misunderstanding on Freyberg's part affected both the initial arrangement of his forces and his strategy during the critical moments of battle. The Allied troops on the island under Freyberg's command became known as Criforce. The airfield at Heraklion to the east was defended by the British 14th Infantry Brigade and an Australian battalion. The airfield at Rethymno was secured by 2 Australian battalions and 2 Greek regiments. However, the Malame airfield in the west, the main target for the Germans, was only defended by a single New Zealand battalion. Freyberg was convinced that an amphibious landing would take place on the coast just west of Chania. Consequently, he positioned the majority of his division along that area, with the Welch Regiment and another battalion from New Zealand held in reserve. No troops were placed on the far side of Maleme. On May 6th, an ultra decrypt revealed that the Germans intended to deploy 2 divisions by air, significantly more than Wavell had initially anticipated. Additional confirmation and information about the German strategy made it clear that their primary focus was an airborne invasion. Unfortunately, The Directorate of Military Intelligence in London had mistakenly inflated the number of reserves being sent by sea on the second day. Freiberg took this a step further, envisioning the possibility of a beach landing with tanks, a concept that had never been suggested. After the conflict, he acknowledged, "We were mostly focused on seaborne landings and not on the threat of airborne landings." In contrast, Churchill was thrilled with the details from the ultra decrypts regarding the airborne attack. It was an uncommon opportunity in warfare to know the precise timing and key objectives of an enemy assault. He signaled to Wavell, "It ought to be a fine opportunity for killing the parachute troops." Although the Allied defenders possessed a significant advantage in intelligence, German military intelligence was alarmingly incompetent, likely due to overconfidence stemming from Germany's previous easy victories. A summary on May 19th, just before the attack, estimated only 5,000 Allied troops on the island, with merely 400 stationed at Heraklion. Photographic reconnaissance flights by Dornier aircraft failed to detect the well-concealed British and Dominion positions. Most surprisingly, the briefing suggested that the Cretan people would be welcoming the German troops. Due to delays in aviation fuel delivery, the operation was pushed back from May 17th to the 20th. In the crucial days leading up to the attack, the bombardment from Richthofen's Stukas and Messerschmitts intensified significantly. Their primary target was the anti-aircraft gun positions. The Bofors gunners faced severe challenges, except at Heraklion airfield, where they were ordered to abandon their weapons and make it seem as if they had been destroyed. The 14th Infantry Brigade wisely chose to keep their guns ready for when the transports arrived with the paratroopers. In another instance of muddled thinking, Freiberg, despite being alerted by Ultra intercepts that the Germans did not intend to damage the airfields they planned to use right away, neglected to sabotage the runways with craters. At dawn on May 20th, the sky was clear, and it promised to be another lovely and warm Mediterranean day. The familiar air assaults began at 6 in the morning, lasting for an hour and a half. When the attack ceased, soldiers emerged from their slit trenches to prepare breakfast. Many believed that the airborne invasion, which they had been warned about for May 17th, might never happen. Even though Freiberg was aware that the invasion was now planned for that morning, he chose not to share the information. Just before 8 in the morning, a different kind of engine filled the air as Junkers 52 transports made their way toward the island. Men hurried to grab their rifles and sprinted back to their positions. At Malame and the Akrotiri Peninsula, near Freiberg's headquarters, oddly shaped aircraft with long, slender wings glided low above. The cry of "gliders" rang out. Rifles, Bren guns, and machine guns opened fire. At Malame, 40 gliders were spotted sweeping over the airfield, landing beyond the western perimeter in the dry ground of the Tavernitis riverbed and on the opposite side. Some gliders crashed, while others were struck by ground fire. Freiberg's failure to deploy troops to the west of Malame quickly became evident. The gliders carried the 1st Battalion of the Fallschirmjäger Storm Regiment, led by Major Koch, known for his previous assault on the Belgian fortress of Eben Emmel. Shortly thereafter, an even louder sound of aircraft engines announced the arrival of the main group of paratroopers. To the astonishment of the younger officers at Kreforce headquarters, General Freiberg, upon hearing the noise, continued with his breakfast. He looked up and simply stated, "They're right on schedule." His calm demeanor was both impressive and concerning to some present. His staff observed through binoculars as waves of Junkers transports released paratroopers, and the battle broke out along the coastal strip. Several younger officers joined in the pursuit of the glider crews that had crashed just north of the quarry where Kreforce headquarters was located. The New Zealanders set to work, eagerly targeting the descending paratroopers. Officers instructed their troops to aim for their boots during the descent to account for the speed. At Malame, 2 additional German battalions landed beyond the Tavernitis. The New Zealand 22nd Battalion, responsible for protecting the airfield, had stationed only a single company there, with just 1 platoon defending the exposed western flank. Just south of the airfield was a rocky outcrop called Hill 107, where Lieutenant Colonel L.W. Andrew had set up his command post. The company commander on the hill's western side effectively directed his men's fire, but when he proposed that the two coastal guns engage, he was told they could only target threats at sea. Major General Freiberg's fixation on a seaborne invasion led him to refuse the use of artillery and reserves, a grave mistake, as the best tactical move would have been an immediate counterattack before the enemy paratroopers could establish themselves. Many of the Germans parachuting southwest of Chania into Prison Valley faced slaughter as they landed amidst well-concealed positions. One group fell directly onto the headquarters of the 23rd Battalion, where the commanding officer shot 5 enemy soldiers, and his adjutant took down 2 more from his position. Shouts of, "Got the bastard," echoed around. In the chaos of battle, very few prisoners were captured, and none were fiercer in their resolve to defend the island than the Cretan people themselves. Elderly men, women, and boys armed with shotguns, old rifles, shovels, and kitchen knives bravely confronted German paratroopers both in the open and those ensnared in the olive trees by their chutes. Father Stylianos Franciscakis, upon hearing of the invasion, rushed to the church and rang the bell. He armed himself with a rifle and led his parishioners north from Paleokora to confront the enemy. The Germans, fueled by a harsh disdain for partisans, brutally stripped shirts or dresses from civilians. Any individuals found with signs of a firearm's recoil or bearing a knife were executed immediately, regardless of age or gender. Cree Force faced significant challenges due to poor communications stemming from a lack of wireless sets, as none had been sent from Egypt in the 3 weeks leading up to the invasion. Consequently, the Australians stationed at Rethymno and the British 14th Infantry Brigade at Heraklion were unaware until 2:30 in the afternoon that the invasion had commenced in the west of the island. The British were fortunate that issues with refueling at the airfields in Greece caused a delay for Oberst Bruno Breuer's 1st Fallschirmjäger Regiment. As a result, the initial attack by Stukas and Messerschmitts had concluded before the wave of Junkers 52 transports began to arrive. Buglers sounded the general alarm just before 5:30 in the afternoon, prompting soldiers to dive into their well-camouflaged positions. The crews of the Bofors guns, which had remained inactive during the air raid, now aimed their barrels, prepared to engage the slow-moving transport planes. Over the next 2 hours, they managed to shoot down 15 of these aircraft. Misled by poor intelligence, Breuer chose to disperse his drops, with the 3rd Battalion landing southwest of Heraklion, the 2nd Battalion at the airfield east of the city, and the 1st Battalion near the village of Gornes, even further east. Hauptmann Burkhardt's 2nd Battalion faced a devastating onslaught. The Highlanders of the Black Watch unleashed a lethal barrage. The few who survived were subsequently overwhelmed in a counterattack by a unit of the 3rd Hussars in Whippet tanks, who ran over and shot any who attempted to escape. Major Schultz's 3rd Battalion, having descended into maize fields and vineyards, fought their way into Heraklion despite fierce resistance from Greek troops and Cretan irregulars defending the city walls. The mayor surrendered the city, but then both the York and Lancaster Regiment and the Leicestershire Regiment counterattacked and forced the German paratroopers to retreat. By nightfall, Oberst Breuer came to realize that his operation had gone terribly awry. At Rethymno, situated between Heraklion and Chania, part of Oberst Alfred Sturm's 2nd Fallschirmjäger Regiment also fell into a trap. Lieutenant Colonel Ian Campbell had positioned his 2 Australian battalions on the high ground overlooking the coastal road and the airfield, with the poorly armed Greek troops positioned in between. As the Junkers flew along the coast, the defenders unleashed a relentless fire, resulting in 7 aircraft being shot down. Others, attempting to escape, dropped their paratroopers into the sea, leading to several drownings as they were ensnared by their parachutes. Some paratroopers landed on rocky terrain and suffered injuries, while others met a horrific fate by dropping into cane brakes where they became impaled on bamboo. Both Australian battalions launched counterattacks. The German survivors fled eastward and established a position in an olive oil factory. Another group, which had landed closer to Rethymno, sought refuge in the village of Perivolia to defend themselves against attacks from Cretan gendarmerie and irregular forces from the town. As darkness quickly enveloped Crete, troops on both sides succumbed to exhaustion and gunfire gradually ceased. German paratroopers were tormented by intense thirst. Their uniforms were intended for northern climates, leading many to suffer from severe dehydration. Cretan irregulars set traps for them near wells and pursued them throughout the night. A significant number of German officers, including the commander of the 7th Fallschirmjäger Division, had been killed. In Athens, word of the catastrophe spread rapidly. General Student gazed at the large map of the island hanging on the wall of the ballroom at the Hotel Grande Bretagne. Although his headquarters lacked precise figures, they were aware that casualties were substantial and that none of the 3 airfields had been secured. Only Maleme appeared to hold potential, but the Storm Regiment in the Tavernidis Valley was nearly out of ammunition. General Feldmarschall List's 12th Army headquarters and Richthofen's 8th Fliegerkorps believed that Operation Mercury needed to be called off, even if it meant abandoning the paratroopers on the island. One captured officer even admitted to an Australian battalion commander, "We do not reinforce failure." Meanwhile, General Freiberg sent a signal to Cairo at 10 o'clock in the evening, asserting that, to his knowledge, his troops still controlled the 3 airfields and the 2 harbors. However, he was gravely misinformed about the situation at Maleme. Colonel Andrews' battered battalion had fought valiantly, but his requests for a counterattack on the airfield were largely ignored. Andrews' superior, Brigadier James Hargest, likely influenced by Freiberg's emphasis on a maritime threat, failed to provide assistance. When Andrew warned him that he would need to withdraw without support, Hargest simply responded, "If you must, you must." Consequently, Maleme and Hill 107 were left unprotected during the night. Refusing to concede defeat, General Student made a decision without notifying General Feldmarschall List. He summoned Hauptmann Klei, the most skilled pilot under his command, and instructed him to conduct a test landing at first light. Klei returned with the news that he had not encountered direct fire. Another Junkers aircraft was sent to deliver ammunition to the Storm Regiment and to evacuate some of the wounded. Student quickly instructed General Major Julius Ringel's 5th Mountain Division to prepare for air transport, but first he dispatched every available reserve from the 7th Fallschirmjäger Division under Oberst Hermann Bernhard Ramke to be dropped near Maleme. With the airfield secured, the first troop carriers began landing at 5 o'clock in the evening with part of the 100th Mountain Regiment. Freiberg, still anticipating an invasion fleet, refused to commit any of his other reserves to a counterattack, except for the 20th New Zealand Battalion. He decided to hold back the Welch Regiment, his largest and best-equipped unit, due to his continued concerns about a seaborne attack near Kenia. However, one of his own staff officers had informed him from captured German plans that the Light Ships Group, bringing reinforcements and supplies, was heading for a location west of Maleme, about 20 kilometers from Chania. Freiberg also ignored the assurances of the senior naval officer on the island, who stated that the Royal Navy could easily handle the small boats approaching by sea. At dusk, once the Luftwaffe had retreated from the Aegean, 3 Royal Navy task forces moved at full speed around both ends of the island. Thanks to ultra-intercepts, they knew the path of their target. Force D, comprising 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers equipped with radar, ambushed the flotilla of caiques that was under the protection of an Italian light destroyer. The searchlights lit up, and the slaughter began. Only 1 caique managed to escape and reach the shore. Observing this naval engagement on the northern horizon, Freiberg was filled with excitement. One of his staff officers recalled him jumping up and down with schoolboy enthusiasm. When it ended, Freiberg's comments suggested that he believed the island was now secure. He went to bed feeling relieved, having not even inquired about the progress of the counterattack against Maleme. The attack was scheduled to start at 1 o'clock in the morning on May 22nd, but Freiberg insisted that the 20th Battalion hold their position until an Australian battalion arrived from Georgiopolis to replace them. Due to a lack of sufficient transport, the Australians were delayed, meant the 20th Battalion was not prepared to join the 28th Maori Battalion in their advance until 3:30 in the morning. The crucial hours of darkness had been lost. Despite the incredible courage of the attackers, who saw Lieutenant Charles Upham earn the first of his 2 Victoria Crosses, the highest honor for valor in Britain, they had little hope against the reinforcements of paratroopers and mountain battalions, not to mention the relentless strafing by Messerschmitts as dawn broke. The weary New Zealanders were forced to retreat in the afternoon, helplessly watching in frustration as Junker's 52 troop carriers landed at a staggering rate of 20 planes per hour. The island was now beyond saving. The disaster also affected naval operations that day. Admiral Cunningham, intent on pursuing the delayed Second Light Ships Group, dispatched Force C and Force A1 into the Aegean Sea in broad daylight. They finally located the group, inflicting some damage, but the ferocity of the German air assaults resulted in even greater losses. The Mediterranean fleet sunk 2 cruisers and a destroyer, while 2 battleships, 2 cruisers, and several destroyers sustained severe damage. The Navy had not yet accepted that the era of the battleship had ended. The following day, 2 more destroyers, including Lord Louis Mountbatten's HMS Kelly and HMS Kashmir, were lost. On the evening of May 22nd, Major General Freiberg opted not to risk a final full-scale counterattack with his 3 available battalions, clearly wishing to avoid the legacy of being remembered as the man who lost the New Zealand division. One can only imagine the frustration among the Australians at Rethymno and the British 14th Infantry Brigade at Heraklion, who believed they had achieved victory in their own battles. A harrowing withdrawal commenced over the rugged terrain of the White Mountains, as the fatigued, thirsty, and worn-out members of Cree Force made their way to the port of Sfakia, where the Royal Navy was once again preparing to evacuate a defeated army. Brigadier Robert Laycock's Commando Brigade arrived as reinforcements at Suda Bay, only to learn that the island was being abandoned. They watched in shock as supplies were set ablaze on the quayside. An unimpressed Laycock discovered that his men were to serve as the rear guard against Ringel's mountain troops. The Royal Navy remained steadfast despite significant losses around Crete. The 14th Infantry Brigade was evacuated aboard 2 cruisers and 6 destroyers, following a masterfully orchestrated withdrawal to Heraklion Harbor during the night of May 28th. Officers recalled the burial of Sir John Moore at Corunna, a poem about the most notable evacuation of the Napoleonic Wars that many had memorized in school. Yet everything had unfolded too smoothly. Saints slowed by a damaged destroyer, the ships failed to clear the channel at the eastern end of the island as dawn broke. Stukas launched their attacks after sunrise. 2 destroyers were lost, and 2 cruisers sustained severe damage. The squadron entered Alexandria Harbor with a grim cargo of the dead. A 5th of the 14th Brigade had perished at sea, a far greater loss than during the confrontation with the paratroopers. A piper from the Black Watch, highlighted by a searchlight, played a lament. Many soldiers openly wept. The Germans viewed the losses inflicted on the Royal Navy during the Crete campaign as retribution for the sinking of the Bismarck. Richthofen and General Ferdinand Schörner celebrated their victory with champagne in Athens. The evacuation from the southern coast also commenced on the night of May 28th, yet the Australians at Rethymno never received the withdrawal order. German paratroopers reported back to Greece that the enemy was still firing. Ultimately, only 50 Australians managed to escape by crossing the mountains, and they were not rescued by submarine until several months later. At Sfakia, chaos erupted, primarily due to the throngs of uncommanded base troops who had rushed ahead. The New Zealanders, Australians, and Royal Marines, who had retreated in an orderly fashion, formed a cordon to prevent the boats from being overwhelmed. The final ships departed in the early hours of June 1st, as the German mountain troops closed in. The Royal Navy successfully evacuated 18,000 men, including nearly all of the New Zealand division. However, another 9,000 men were left behind, becoming prisoners. Their resentment is easy to understand. On the very first day, Allied forces had eliminated 1,856 paratroopers. In total, students' troops suffered around 6,000 casualties, with 146 aircraft destroyed and 165 sustaining substantial damage. These Junkers 52 transports would be sorely missed by the Wehrmacht later that summer during the invasion of the Soviet Union. Richthofen's 8th Fliegerkorps lost an additional 60 aircraft. The Battle of Crete represented the heaviest blow the Wehrmacht had faced since the war began. Unfortunately, despite the fierce defense put up by the Allies, the battle transformed into a needless and heartbreaking defeat. Surprisingly, both sides interpreted the results of the airborne operation in contrasting ways. Hitler vowed never to conduct a significant airborne drop again, while the Allies felt encouraged to establish their own paratrooper units, though this led to mixed outcomes later in the war. The decision to redirect Wavel's forces to Greece in the spring of 1941 came at the worst possible moment. This was yet another example of the British mismanaging limited resources by spreading them too thin. Winston Churchill and the British leadership seemed unable to match the German army's ability to prioritize ruthlessly. The chance for the British to secure victory in North Africa in 1941 vanished the moment forces were sent to Greece, paving the way for Erwin Rommel's arrival in Tripoli with the first elements of the Afrika Korps. The choice of Rommel by Hitler was not well received among senior officers in the Army High Command, who preferred General Major Hans Freiherr von Funk. Funk had been dispatched to assess the situation in Libya, but was disliked by Hitler due to his past association with General Oberst Werner Freiherr von Fritsch, whom Hitler had dismissed from command in 1938. Rommel, with his non-aristocratic background and a distinct Swabian accent, was viewed as a bit of an adventurer. Many in the army regarded him as an arrogant self-publicist and did not trust his ability to use the admiration of Hitler and Joseph Goebbels to circumvent the chain of command. Rommel quickly recognized that the isolated campaign in Africa offered him an ideal opportunity to disregard instructions from the Army High Command. Furthermore, he made himself unpopular by suggesting that instead of invading Greece, Germany should have shifted its focus to North Africa to seize the Middle East and its valuable oil reserves. Hitler, having wavered multiple times regarding the significance of Libya and the necessity of sending troops to North Africa, now believed it was crucial to prevent the collapse of Benito Mussolini's regime. He was also concerned that British forces might connect with French North Africa, with the Vichy army potentially rejoining them under the influence of General Maxime Weygand. Even after the failed Dakar expedition the previous September, where the Free French and a British naval squadron faced defeat from Vichy loyalists, Hitler continued to overestimate the impact of General Charles de Gaulle at that point. When Rommel arrived in Tripoli on February 12, 1941, he was joined by Oberst Rudolf Schmundt, who was Adolf Hitler's main military adjutant. This significantly bolstered his influence with both the Italians and higher-ranking German officers. The previous day, they were astonished to hear from the commander of the ex-Fliegerkorps in Sicily that Italian generals had urged him not to bomb Benghazi, as many owned property there. Rommel promptly requested Schmundt to call Hitler without delay. A few hours later, German bombers were dispatched. A German liaison officer provided Rommel a briefing on the situation in Tripolitania. Many of the retreating Italians had discarded their weapons and commandeered trucks to flee. General Italo Garibaldi, the replacement for General Graziani, refused to maintain a defensive line against the British, who were advancing at El Agheila. Rommel took control of the situation, sending 2 Italian divisions forward, and on February 15th, he ordered the initial German units to land, including a reconnaissance team and a battalion of assault guns. Kübelwagen, the heavier German versions of the Jeep, were camouflaged as tanks to dissuade the British from pushing further. By the end of the month, the arrival of more units from the 5th Light Division motivated Rommel to begin skirmishing with the British. It was not until the end of March, when Rommel had 25,000 German soldiers on African soil, that he felt prepared to advance. Over the following 6 weeks, he would receive additional forces from the 5th Light Division and the 15th Panzer Division, but the front line was still 700 kilometers east of Tripoli. Rommel faced a significant logistical challenge, which he preferred to overlook. When difficulties arose, he instinctively blamed jealousy within the German armed forces for his supply shortages. In reality, crises frequently occurred when transports were sunk in the Libyan Sea by the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy. Rommel also failed to understand that the preparations for Operation Barbarossa rendered the North African campaign even more of a secondary concern. Additional issues stemmed from the dependence on the Italians. The Italian army struggled with a chronic shortage of motor transport. Their fuel was often of such poor quality that it was unsuitable for German vehicles, and their rations were notoriously inadequate, primarily consisting of tins of meat marked AM for Administrazione Militare. Italian soldiers claimed the initials referred to Arabo Morte, meaning dead Arab, while their German allies dubbed it Alter Man, translating to old man, or even Mussolini's rear. Rommel was fortunate that the Western Desert Force of the Allies was severely weakened at this time. The 7th Armored Division had been pulled back to Cairo for repairs and replaced by a significantly reduced and ill-prepared 2nd Armored Division. Meanwhile, the newly arrived 9th Australian Division took the place of the 6th Australian Division, which had been sent to Greece. Despite this, Rommel's requests for reinforcements to advance into Egypt were declined. He was informed that a Panzer Corps would be dispatched that winter once the Soviet Union had been dealt with, and he was advised against launching a full-scale offensive before then. To the dismay of General Garibaldi, Rommel quickly disregarded his orders and advanced the 5th Light Division into Cyrenaica, taking advantage of the Allied forces' vulnerabilities. One of Wavel's major blunders was replacing O'Connor with the inexperienced Lieutenant General Philip Neame. Wavell also misjudged Rommel's eagerness to attack immediately, assuming he would wait until May. The midday temperatures in the desert had already reached 50 degrees Celsius, causing soldiers in steel helmets to suffer from severe headaches, mainly due to dehydration. On April 3rd, Rommel resolved to push the Allied forces back from Cyrenaica. While the Italian Brescia Division proceeded to capture Benghazi, which Neame evacuated in haste, Rommel instructed the 5th Light Division to disrupt the coastal road before Tobruk. Calamity swiftly struck the Allied forces, and Tobruk itself became encircled. The frail 2nd Armored Division lost all its tanks during the withdrawal, hindered by mechanical failures and a lack of fuel. On April 8th, its commander, Major General Gambier Perry, and his staff were taken prisoner at Mekili, along with most of the 3rd Indian Motorized Brigade. On the same day, General Neame, accompanied by General O'Connor, who had come to offer advice, were captured when their driver took the wrong route. The Germans celebrated the vast supply stores they found at Mekili. Rommel picked a pair of British tank goggles, wearing them on his cap as a signature style. He aimed to capture Tobruk, convinced that the British were preparing to abandon it, only to find that the 9th Australian Division was not ready to give in. Tobruk received reinforcements by sea, allowing Major General Leslie Morshed to command 4 brigades equipped with strong artillery and anti-tank units. Morshed, known to his troops as Ming the Merciless, quickly bolstered the defenses of Tobruk. The 9th Australian Brigade, despite being somewhat inexperienced and undisciplined, much to the frustration of the British officers, proved to be a tough group of fighters. On the night of April 13th, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel launched his main attack on Tobruk, unaware of the strong defenses in place. Even after suffering heavy casualties and being repelled, he attempted several more assaults, much to the dismay of his officers, who began to see him as a ruthless commander. This was an ideal time for an Allied counteroffensive, but the British and Australians were misled into believing Rommel's forces were significantly larger than they truly were. Rommel's demands for reinforcements and more air support frustrated General Franz Halder and the Army High Command, especially since Rommel had ignored their warnings about overextending himself. Nevertheless, Rommel sent some of his weary units forward to the Egyptian border, where General Archibald Wavell held the line with the 22nd Guards Brigade until additional units arrived from Cairo. Rommel dismissed General Major Johannes Streich, commander of the 5th Light Division, for prioritizing the safety of his troops. General Major Heinrich Kirchheim, Streich's replacement, was also critical of Rommel's command style. He later wrote to General Halder, expressing frustration with Rommel's frantic movements among widely scattered units, ordering raids and spreading his troops thin. Disturbed by the conflicting reports from North Africa, Halder decided to send Generalleutnant Friedrich Paulus, who had served alongside Rommel in the same infantry regiment during World War I. Halder believed Paulus might be the only person capable of restraining Rommel's reckless behavior. Paulus, known for his meticulous nature, was vastly different from the bold field commander Rommel. Their only commonality was their modest beginnings. Paulus's mission was to persuade Rommel that he could not rely on significant reinforcements and to understand his intentions. Rommel, however, refused to withdraw his forward units at the Egyptian border, planning to launch yet another attack on Tobruk with the newly arrived 15th Panzer Division. On April 30th, another attack was met with strong resistance and significant losses, particularly in tanks. Rommel's forces were also severely lacking in ammunition. On May 2nd, Paulus, using his authority from the Supreme Command, issued Rommel a written order stating that further attacks could not proceed unless they observed enemy withdrawal. Upon his return, he informed Halder that the primary issue in North Africa was not Tobruk, but rather the resupply of the Afrika Korps and Rommel's attitude. Rommel stubbornly refused to recognize the substantial challenge of transporting supplies across the Mediterranean and unloading them in Tripoli. Wavell, worried about his depleted tank numbers after the losses in Greece and Cyrenaica, faced the formidable 15th Panzer Division. Churchill initiated Operation Tiger in early May, organizing the transport of nearly 300 Crusader tanks and over 50 Hurricanes by convoy through the Mediterranean. Although part of the ex-Air Corps remained stationed in Sicily, which posed a significant risk, poor visibility allowed only one transport to be lost on the journey. An eager Churchill pressured Wavell to launch an offensive along the frontier even before the new tanks had arrived. Although Operation Brevity, led by Brigadier Gott, began successfully on May 15th, it soon triggered a swift counterattack by Rommel. The Indian and British forces were pushed back, allowing the Germans to reclaim the Halfaya Pass. Once the new Crusader tanks were finally delivered, Churchill called for another offensive named Operation Battleaxe. He refused to listen to concerns about the need for repairs on many of the unloaded tanks, or that the 7th Armored Division required time to adapt to the new equipment. Once again, Wavell found himself burdened by conflicting orders from London. Earlier in April, a pro-German faction had seized power in Iraq, emboldened by British vulnerabilities in the region. The chiefs of staff in London recommended intervention, which Churchill promptly approved, leading to troops from India landing in Basra. Rashid Ali al-Gailani, the new leader of Iraq, sought assistance from Germany, but confusion in Berlin meant that no help came. Fighting erupted on May 2nd when the Iraqi army besieged the British airbase at Habaniya near Fallujah. 4 days later, the German High Command opted to send Messerschmitt 110s and Heinkel 111s bombers via Syria to northern Iraq, specifically Mosul and Kirkuk, but they soon became inoperable, primarily due to engine damage caused by dust. British Imperial troops from India and Jordan moved towards Baghdad. Gailani's government had no choice but to agree to the British demand on May 31st for the continued movement of troops across Iraqi land. While the crisis in Iraq did not diminish Wavell's forces, Churchill ordered him to invade Lebanon and Syria, where the French Vichy forces had assisted the Germans in their failed deployment to Mosul and Kirkuk. Churchill mistakenly worried that the Germans would use Syria as a launching point for attacks on Palestine and Egypt. Admiral Darlan, the deputy to Pétain and Vichy's Minister of Defense, requested that the Germans refrain from provocative actions in the area, while he sent French reinforcements to their colony to resist the British. On May 21st, the day after the invasion of Crete, a Vichy French fighter group arrived in Greece on its way to Syria. "The war is becoming ever more bizarre," Richthofen wrote in his diary. "We are supposed to supply them and entertain them." Operation Exporter, the Allied invasion of Vichy Lebanon and Syria, which included Free French troops, began on June 8th with an advance north from Palestine across the Litani River. The Vichy commander, General Henri Dentz, requested Luftwaffe support as well as reinforcements from other Vichy forces in North Africa and France. The Germans determined that they could not provide air cover, but permitted French troops with anti-tank weapons to travel by train through the occupied Balkans to Salonika and then by ship to Syria. However, the British naval presence was too significant, and Turkey, wishing to avoid involvement, denied transit rights. The French army of the Levant soon realized it was doomed, but remained resolute in its intention to resist fiercely. Fighting continued until July 12th. Following the signing of an armistice at Acre, Syria was declared under the control of the Free French. Wavel's lack of enthusiasm for the campaign in Syria, along with his pessimism about Operation Battle Axe, set him on a collision course with the Prime Minister. Churchill's impatience and his complete misunderstanding of the challenges in executing two offensives at once brought Wavell to the brink of despair. The Prime Minister, overconfident after the delivery of tanks in Operation Tiger, dismissed Wavell's concerns regarding the effectiveness of German anti-tank guns. Those guns, rather than the German panzers, were responsible for destroying most of his armored vehicles. The British Army was notably slow to create a weapon that could match the formidable German 88mm gun. Its own 2-pounder, often dismissed as a pea shooter, proved ineffective. Additionally, the British Army's conservative approach hindered the use of the 3.7-inch anti-aircraft gun for anti-tank purposes. On June 15th, the Battle Axe campaign began similarly to brevity. Despite the British recapturing the Halfaya Pass and achieving a few local victories, they quickly found themselves pushed back when Rommel deployed all his tanks from the encirclement of Tobruk. Over 3 days of intense fighting, the British were outflanked once again and had to retreat to the coastal plain, narrowly avoiding encirclement. While the Afrika Korps sustained more casualties, the British lost 91 tanks, primarily to anti-tank gunfire, whereas the Germans lost just 12. The Royal Air Force also suffered more losses in aircraft than the Luftwaffe during this engagement. German soldiers, with a fair amount of exaggeration, boasted that they had destroyed 200 British tanks and claimed it as the greatest tank battle of all time. On June 21st, Winston Churchill replaced Wavell with General Sir Claude Auchinleck, widely referred to as the Auk. Wavell then took over Auchinleck's previous role as Commander-in-Chief in India. Soon after, Adolf Hitler promoted Rommel to General of the Panzer Troops and increased his autonomy, much to the dismay of General Halder. Churchill's frustration with Wavell and the despondent leadership of the British Army was driven by two main concerns. One was the urgency for decisive action to uplift morale at home and prevent the nation from descending into a state of gloom. The other was to make a strong impression on the United States and President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Most importantly, Churchill needed to dispel the partially justified impression that Britain was waiting for the United States to enter the conflict and rescue the situation. To Churchill's great relief, Roosevelt had been re-elected as president in November 1940. The British Prime Minister was further encouraged by the strategic review prepared that month by the Chief of Operations of the United States Navy. Known as Plan Dog, this review led to American-British staff talks at the end of January 1941. These discussions, which took place in Washington under the code name ABC-1, continued until March and laid the groundwork for Allied strategy when the United States joined the war. The principle of Germany first was established as the fundamental strategy. This acknowledged that despite the ongoing war in the Pacific against Japan, the United States would prioritize the defeat of Nazi Germany. It was evident that the British could not secure victory on their own without a significant deployment of American forces to Europe. A British defeat would jeopardize both the United States and its global trade. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had identified the threat from Nazi Germany even prior to the Munich Agreement of 1938. Understanding the crucial role of air power in the anticipated conflict, he swiftly launched a program to produce 15,000 aircraft annually for the United States Army Air Force. General George C. Marshall, the Assistant Chief of Staff of the United States Army, attended the meeting to discuss this initiative. While he endorsed the plan, Marshall pointed out the urgent need to bolster their insufficient ground forces. With just over 200,000 soldiers, the United States Army had only 9 inadequately manned divisions, which amounted to a mere fraction of the size of the German army. Roosevelt was struck by this reality. Less than a year later, he supported Marshall's promotion to Chief of Staff, which coincided with the day Germany invaded Poland. Marshall was a formal man known for his integrity and exceptional organizational skills. Under his leadership, the United States Army would expand from 200,000 to 8 million personnel during the war. He consistently provided Roosevelt with candid assessments and remained unaffected by the president's charisma. However, his greatest challenge was Roosevelt's frequent failure to keep him updated on discussions and decisions made with others, particularly those involving Winston Churchill. For Churchill, his relationship with Roosevelt represented the most critical component of British foreign policy. He invested tremendous energy, creativity, and sometimes unreserved flattery to gain Roosevelt's support for what his nearly bankrupt nation desperately needed to endure. In a lengthy and detailed letter dated December 8, 1940, Churchill requested a decisive act of constructive non-belligerency to sustain British resistance. This plan included utilizing United States Navy warships to counter the U-boat threat and securing 3 million tons of merchant shipping to preserve Britain's Atlantic lifeline, following the severe losses of over 2 million gross tons experienced thus far. He also called for 2,000 aircraft each month. Lastly, I arrive at the issue of finance, Churchill wrote. Britain's dollar credits were on the verge of running out. In fact, the orders already placed or being negotiated far exceeded the total exchange resources that were still available to Great Britain. It was the most important and dignified appeal for assistance ever made. It was nearly a year before the United States would enter the war. Roosevelt received the letter while on board the USS Tuscaloosa in the Caribbean. He reflected on its contents, and the following day he convened a press conference. On December 17th, he shared his well-known but straightforward analogy of a man whose house is burning down, asking his neighbor for the loan of a hose. This was Roosevelt's way of shaping public opinion before the Lend-Lease Bill was introduced to Congress. In the House of Commons, Churchill praised it as the most unsorted act in the history of any nation. However, behind closed doors, the British government felt apprehensive about the stringent conditions tied to Lend-Lease. The Americans demanded an audit of all British assets and insisted that no financial support could begin until all foreign exchange and gold reserves had been fully depleted. A United States Navy warship was dispatched to Cape Town to collect the last of the British gold stored there. British-owned companies in the United States, including Courtaulds, Shell, and Lever, had to be sold off at drastically reduced prices, only to be resold for significant profits. Churchill generously attributed this to Roosevelt's need to counter the anti-British critics of Lend-Lease, many of whom recalled the British and French default on debts from World War I. Overall, the British underestimated how many Americans viewed them as imperialists, elitists, and skilled at getting others to fight their battles. But Britain was in a vulnerable position and could not voice any objections. Resentment over the terms would persist into the post-war period, especially since it had been the British cash payments of $4.5 billion for arms orders in 1940 that helped lift the United States from its Great Depression and fueled its wartime economic expansion. Unlike the high-quality supplies that would come later, the equipment acquired in the desperate days of 1940 was unimpressive, and it did not significantly change the situation. The 50 destroyers left over from World War I, exchanged for the British Virgin Islands in September 1940, required extensive work to become seaworthy. On December 30th, Roosevelt spoke to the American public over the radio in a fireside chat to support the agreement. He stated that, "We must be the great arsenal of democracy," and that became reality. On the evening of March 8th, 1941, the Senate passed the Lend-Lease Bill. Roosevelt's bold new policy included declaring a Pan-American security zone in the Western Atlantic, setting up bases in Greenland, and planning to replace British forces in Iceland, which was a crucial staging area and airbase. This occurred in early July. British warships, starting with the damaged aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious, could now be repaired in American ports, and Royal Air Force pilots began training at United States Army Air Force bases. A significant development was that the United States Navy commenced escort duties for British convoys as far as Iceland. The German Foreign Office responded to these changes by hoping that Britain would be defeated before American military supplies became impactful, which they estimated would occur in 1942. However, Hitler was too focused on Operation Barbarossa to pay much attention. At this point, his primary concern was to avoid provoking America into joining the war before he could defeat the Soviet Union. He denied Gross Admiral Raeder's request for U-boats to operate in the Western Atlantic up to the 3-mile zone of American coastal waters. Winston Churchill later remarked that the U-boat threat was the only true fear he experienced during the war. At one point, he even entertained the idea of using force to reclaim the southern ports of neutral Ireland if necessary. The Royal Navy was in dire need of escort vessels for convoys due to significant losses during the unsuccessful intervention in Norway, and destroyers had to be reserved in case of a German invasion. During the East Coast rampage, when U-boats targeted coastal shipping in the North Sea, Captain Ernst Kahls in U-173 received the Knight's Cross for sinking 9 ships in just 2 weeks. From the fall of 1940, the German U-boat fleet began to inflict serious harm on Allied shipping. With bases along France's Atlantic coast and the torpedo detonator issues that had plagued U-boat operations earlier in the war resolved, in 1 week of September, U-boats sank 27 British vessels totaling over 160,000 tons. The impact of these losses was even more pronounced given the limited number of submarines the Germans had active. In February 1941, Grand Admiral Raeder had only 22 ocean-going U-boats in operation. Despite his constant appeals to Adolf Hitler, the submarine construction initiative was deprioritized as preparations for the invasion of the Soviet Union took precedence. Initially, the German Navy had high hopes for its pocket battleships and armed merchant raiders. Although the sinking of the Graf Spee off Montevideo was celebrated by the British, the most effective mission was executed by the pocket battleship Admiral Scheer. During a lengthy voyage, spanning 161 days across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, she successfully sank 17 ships. It quickly became apparent that U-boats were far more efficient than pocket battleships and surface raiders, which only accounted for the sinking of 57,000 tons of shipping. The most accomplished U-boat commander, Otto Kretschmer, sank 37 ships, surpassing the tonnage sunk by the Admiral Scheer. The Royal Navy's escort fleet began to grow only after refurbishing 50 aging American destroyers and launching corvettes from British shipyards. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who led the U-boat command of the Kriegsmarine, regarded his mission as a tonnage war. His goal was to sink ships more rapidly than the British could construct them. In mid-October 1940, Dönitz initiated Wolfpack tactics, where up to a dozen U-boats would assemble upon spotting a convoy and then begin sinking ships at night. The flames of one vessel would light up or outline the others. The first Wolfpack targeted convoy SC-7 and successfully sank 17 ships. Shortly after, Günther Prien, the U-boat commander responsible for sinking HMS Royal Oak in Scapa Flow, led a Wolfpack against convoy HX-79 from Halifax. Using just 4 submarines, they sank 12 out of 49 ships. In February 1941, Allied losses rose sharply once more. It wasn't until March that Royal Navy escort vessels managed to retaliate by sinking 3 U-boats, including the U-47 commanded by Prien, and capturing U-99 along with its commander Otto Kretschmer. The introduction of the long-range Type 9 submarine soon led to increased losses once again until summer, when ultra-intercepts began to turn the tide, aided by the support of the United States Navy in September, which started escorting ships in the Western Atlantic. Bletchley Park's intercepted signals often did not lead directly to the sinking of U-boats at this point, but they significantly aided convoy planners in evasive routing, helping to steer ships away from lurking wolf packs. This information also gave Naval Intelligence and Coastal Command a much clearer understanding of the German Navy's resupply and operational procedures. The Battle of the Atlantic was a life marked by maritime monotony, set against a constant backdrop of fear. The bravest among them were the crews of oil tankers, fully aware they were navigating on a massive incendiary device. From captains to deckhands, everyone found themselves wondering if they were already being hunted by U-boats and whether a torpedo explosion might suddenly throw them from their bunks. Only terrible weather and rough seas seemed to lessen the threat. Their lives were perpetually damp and cold, spent in heavy coats or waterproof gear, with few opportunities to dry out. The eyes of lookouts strained from scanning the gray water in a hopeless quest for a periscope. Hot cocoa and corned beef sandwiches provided their only moments of relief and comfort. On the escort vessels, primarily destroyers and corvettes, the sweeping radar screens and the pinging sonar offered a captivating yet terrifying experience. The psychological burden was even heavier for merchant Navy sailors, who often felt powerless to retaliate. They knew that if a convoy faced a wolfpack attack and they had to jump into the oily waters after being torpedoed, their chances of rescue were slim. A ship stopping to save survivors became an easy target for another U-boat. The relief of reaching the Mersey or the Clyde on the return home transformed the atmosphere on board. German U-boat crews endured even greater discomfort, with condensation streaming down the walls and the air thick with the smell of wet clothing and unwashed bodies. Yet, morale remained relatively high during this stage of the war, as they enjoyed successes while British countermeasures were still developing. Much of their time was spent on the surface, which enhanced speed and fuel efficiency. The greatest peril came from Allied flying boats. Once an aircraft was spotted, the klaxon would sound, and the U-boat would execute a well-rehearsed crash dive. Until radar was installed on aircraft, the likelihood of locating U-boats remained quite low. In April 1941, the Allies suffered shipping losses amounting to 688,000 tons, but there were some positive developments. Air cover for convoys expanded, although the Greenland Gap, the vast central area of the North Atlantic beyond the reach of the Royal Canadian Air Force and RAF Coastal Command, still existed. A German armed trawler was captured off Norway, revealing 2 Enigma coding machines along with the settings from the prior month. Then on May 9th, HMS Bulldog successfully forced U-110 to surface. An armed boarding party seized her code books and Enigma cipher machine before they could be destroyed. Other captured vessels, including a weather ship and a transport, also yielded significant intelligence. As Allied convoys began to break through the U-boat defenses, and after 3 submarines were ambushed off Cape Verde, Donitz started to worry that their codes might have been compromised, leading to a tightening of Enigma security. Overall, it had been a very challenging year for the Royal Navy. Losses escalated in the Mediterranean during the Battle of Crete, and the formidable battle cruiser HMS Hood was destroyed by a single shell from the Bismarck on May 23rd in the Denmark Strait between Greenland and Iceland. Admiral Günther Lütjens, commanding the Bismarck, had departed from the Baltic along with the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen. The shock in London was profound, and so was the thirst for revenge. More than 100 warships participated in the hunt for the Bismarck, including the battleships HMS King George V and Rodney, as well as the aircraft carrier Ark Royal. Though contact was lost by the cruiser HMS Suffolk, on May 26th, a Catalina flying boat spotted the Bismarck while the British battle squadron was running low on fuel. The next day, with poor weather conditions, Swordfish torpedo bombers launched from the Ark Royal. 2 torpedoes damaged the Bismarck's steering gear while she attempted to reach the safety of Brest, leaving the German warship circling aimlessly. This granted King George V and Rodney, accompanied by the 4th Destroyer Flotilla, the opportunity to approach for the decisive strike with powerful broadsides from their main batteries. Admiral Luton sent a final message: "Ship incapable of maneuvering, will fight to the last shell, long live the Führer." The cruiser HMS Dorsetshire was dispatched to deliver the finishing blow with torpedoes. Lütjens, who gave the command to sink the ship, perished along with 2,200 of his sailors. Only 110 men were rescued from the ocean.